Got it.
There we go. Recording in progress.
There we go.
Right, second attempt. Brogan is here. We are no longer live on Facebook. We have moved to Zoom. This link will be up. The dog's still going to go. It's still going to bark.
It's the dog barking at something else. I am coming back. Do an intro, Gemma. I'll be back.
Yeah, Brogan will be back. We haven't scheduled already. So some of you are probably members of my Informed to Perform page. In future, these interviews will probably end up going on there, but I thought this was too important not to just put on my public page. So Brogan is, I'll big her up because she won't big herself up as much as I big her up. So Brogan is a women's fitness specialist expert. Women within fitness, that's right, isn't it? That's women within fitness coaching. That's who Brogan is. That's what she does. She is also a biomechanics expert, and so it's not just, she's a personal trainer, biomechanics expert, and sort of looks at you holistically in terms of fitness, health, nutrition, how you're moving, etc. So I thought, as an equestrian, a horse rider who has had 2 children, and who I would say I have a fairly reasonable body awareness, but I knew nothing really, in all honesty, about how my body was going to react to pregnancy, how I would feel getting back in the saddle, and what the effects of all that were going to be. I had my first child nearly 4.5 years ago, and I think I then learned a lot after I'd had her. Let's put it that way. I learned a lot after I'd had her, and I discovered a lot more about probably what I should have done and the things I probably did wrong, from my perspective. So I'll probably put this caveat in here because it is going to go on my page. Any advice we hear today, I'm sure Brogan will say the same. Get clearance from a doctor, a midwife, a physio. This is sort of going to be slightly generic, general advice to people who are planning to become pregnant and how you can maybe get your body prepared for it, who are currently pregnant and want to keep their body as healthy as they can, and are postpartum at any stage of that postpartum journey, whether that's very recent or further down the line if you've never rehabbed. But in all of those cases, please don't do anything just because we said it on here. Get clearance from a doctor, get clearance from a midwife. If anything hurts or doesn't feel comfortable, stop. As I'm sure Brogan would have covered this anyway, but because it's on my page, I just feel like we have to put this in.
Yes, absolutely.
This is just some general advice for things that, as long as you are cleared by your doctor to do so, hopefully will be very helpful. Because there are things that I definitely did, and I think probably all sporting people are similar. Anyone who loves exercise is probably similar. All I ever see on equestrian pages on things like Facebook are, I'm going to have a baby in 2 months' time, and I've been told I have to stop riding now by my physio or by my doctor or whoever. How early did you all ride again? And everyone's like, I rode one day after, I gave birth and rode the next day. I rode all the way up to 9 months, and then I, gave birth and rode 3 hours afterwards. And you always hear these, and that's great. And you know what? For some people, that probably works, and they probably feel no ill effects. But from my perspective, as an equestrian coach, as somebody who probably got back on too quickly the first time, the second time was much more sensible, but probably still got on too quickly, it is not a competition. And as I discovered, the damage you could potentially do to your body by doing things too quickly is going to make it a far longer rehab journey than if you maybe take some of this lady's advice and listen to the experts and know where to go. And I had no idea where to go, and that is why I wanted to talk to Brogan, because I wish I'd known somebody like her when I was going through my journey. So that is where I'll start. That's kind of the caveat. So have you got anything to add about your introduction, about who, what you do, what your ethos is, what your kind of,
yes, absolutely. I think you announced me very well then, so thank you for that. I keep saying to everyone else, they introduced me much better than I introduced myself, so that's fantastic, thank you. I think what you've touched on is very key there, is that a lot of people, even if they aren't equestrian, if they're any sort of sport or any line of fitness, there isn't much information surrounding, pregnancy training, but I think most importantly, postpartum rehab and recovery, because I think as women, we're very, I'm a woman, I can do anything, and we are, and we can. But, we sort of go, I had a baby, but I love what I do. I love horse riding. I like running. I like spinning. I like biking outside. And, I did it before. I can do it again. It doesn't matter. And the body goes through, pregnancy, not to use, well, it can be very traumatic. Pregnancy itself can be very traumatic. It puts a hell of a lot of pressure on the pelvis. Lower lumbar spine, thoracic spine, pelvic floor, core. There's a hell of a lot. And that's before you've even gone through childbirth itself. So there's a lot that's impacted. And so we want to make sure that when you go back to that activity postpartum, you have rehabbed in a way which means that 6 months down the line, hopefully you don't then feel like you're suffering an injury, or you've got chronic back pain, or you've got chronic hip pain or knee pain, because these areas haven't been rehabbed postpartum. So yeah, exactly that. And, I think there's a lack of information out there. That's why I'm very passionate about it anyway. I don't have kids myself, but from hearing it from friends, colleagues, acquaintances who all say the same thing, and all say, God, I wish I'd had access to this information postpartum. I wish I'd just had it. And it's becoming more and more obvious now, because I think people, want to look after their well-being a lot more. I've noticed since COVID happened, people want to look after their well-being a lot more. So there's generally a lot more interest in this, and a lot more kind of inquisitive thinking of, maybe after I have a baby, I don't just go out and get on a horse or run 10K like I did before pregnancy. So yeah, definitely, it's important that we understand how to rehab the body properly to, my little saying is helping women prepare for their future now. So you're always kind of 3 steps ahead of yourself. You're always, when you're planning to become pregnant, you're doing that work in beforehand. While you're pregnant, you're planning for postpartum. When you're postpartum, you're planning for, hopefully in 18 months to 2 years' time, being back to full physical peak. Because it can take up to 12 months to 2 years to really get back to where you were, postpartum. And everyone just thinks, like you say, it's that 4 weeks after you've had a baby, but it's not. It can be 4, 5, 6, 20 odd years of dysfunction that you're still postpartum.
That phrase bounce back has a lot to answer for, doesn't it? That, the women who bounce back from pregnancy. And I think that's a real interesting point, actually, is that physically, as in aesthetically, some people may well look like they bounce back from pregnancy in terms of they get their figure back, they look thin again, whatever it might be. But there's no, well, I think you'd say there's no way that physically, internally, their structures can possibly have bounced back as quickly as aesthetically they may look like they have.
Yeah, and I think, some women are very lucky. And they'll jump back into their size 10 jeans, they'll have zero incontinence, their pelvic floor is like they've never had children, and they're just the anomaly of woman that we all have to live amongst that just sort of recovers perfectly. But yeah, exactly like you say, from a social media point of view, all we ever do is see women, and we congratulate them when they're back in their size 10s or back in their size 12s, when actually they could be suffering from incontinence, and quite bad. They could be suffering from prolapse. They could be suffering from back pain due to the fact that their core hasn't healed or rehabbed properly. They could be suffering with diastasis, so abdominal separation isn't coming together. But when we rush back into exercise, where we depend on the core muscles for quite a lot, can really lead to dysfunction and aches and pains in the body, and potentially injury. So yeah, from the outside, it looks okay, and we look through, we think, oh, she looks great. But from the inside, is it really actually functioning as well as we want to, or is that female living with quite a lot of dysfunction that is having an impact on her quality of life?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's probably a good place to start, isn't it? Is that kind of pelvic floor, the pelvic floor health, I think is just, I think, such a huge part of a woman's life, actually, that people don't realise, even if you don't have children. Your pelvic floor is going to be something you're going to have to be aware of at some point. And whether you've had children or not, this is probably a clip that's worth listening to, because the other thing, I will say, as someone who's experienced it. So I was going to bounce, according to all my friends. I was fit, I was athletic, I was quite slim before I got pregnant. I was strong. I was in a very active job. I was going to barely put on any weight in pregnancy. You wouldn't even know I was pregnant for the first 20 weeks. That's what everyone thought. I got pregnant at 9 weeks. I couldn't hide it. That is how quickly my bump showed in my first pregnancy. I had a ginormous bump. People were like, "Are you sure they've got your dates right? Are you sure it's not twins?" And I like, whatever. That doesn't bother me, but it's fine. But I get it, because no one expected me to have such a big bump, because I should have been a slim pregnant person. That's what everyone thought I would be. I stayed active through pregnancy, obviously, and then I didn't have the greatest of births. I mean, you could hear my story, and some people would be like, "Oh my God, that sounds like nothing compared to mine," and that's fine. And others would be like, "Oh, good grief, that sounds horrific. I'm so glad mine wasn't like that." Everyone's birth story is very individual. But I was induced early, which is not ideal for anyone's body, quite early. I think I was just shy of 38 weeks with Scarlett, because I had, I always forget the name of it, the liver thing. It'll come back to me in a minute. So I had to be induced. Then the induction was all a bit all over the place, and none of this is within my control, like, basically. And I think that is the bit that's so hard to deal with, is so much of it out of your control. I then had a labour that the contractions went ridiculous, and then they stopped entirely. Oh no, they had to give me an injection to calm them down, and then the baby got stuck a bit, just everything. So it carried on and on and on, and because I'd been monitored, I had to be on my back the whole time. My pelvis was quite painful by this point. I then had a fairly severe postpartum hemorrhage, lost over 1.5 litres of blood. And so then I ended up stuck on my back for another however long, because they wouldn't let me get up. So with all of that, I also had an episiotomy. So I had, for anyone who doesn't know what that is, that's when they cut you, which again, not ideal, but tearing, episiotomy, whatever. So prior to pregnancy, though, prior to the birth, I'd done my pelvic floor exercise. I knew about strengthening and lengthening. I learned quite a lot myself. Don't think I really got taught a lot of it, but I like to know. So I learned about strengthening and lengthening my pelvic floor. I didn't necessarily go down the hypnobirthing route, but I did look into some of those kind of natural pain relief type things, and they worked for me. I then spent a week feeling rubbish. We were in hospital for a week afterwards. So actually I had to rest, which was probably a good thing for me, because otherwise I'd have been trying to do too much. And my episiotomy healed very, very quickly. I scar really badly, but I also heal very quickly. But basically, even after all of that, I then probably got back on a bit too early. So I think I was probably about 2 weeks postpartum, and I got back on a horse. Now, I wouldn't have said I had a weak pelvic floor beforehand. In fact, when she was stitching me up, a bit graphic, I know, but she was like, "You just have like a whole extra line of muscle." She said, "Horse riders are all the same. They always have this extra line of muscle that a lot of people just don't have." I still have quite a mild under control cystocele, which for anyone who doesn't know is a prolapse bladder. And most of my friends would not be as, and they won't mind me saying this, wouldn't be as into sport as I am. They wouldn't be as body aware as I am. They wouldn't have gone through all the things that I've gone through to try and make sure it didn't happen. And it still happened to me. So, and this is something I just wanted to touch on very quickly before we go into pelvic floor health and how you can help it, is if anything goes wrong with your body, that's a horrible word, but you know what I mean? If anything isn't quite right with your body, I think it's important for people to realise that it's not necessarily your fault. I think people are quite quick, and I was, "Oh my God, I did this, I did that. If I'd done that differently, I wouldn't have," things like that, I think are quite quick to come into people's minds.
Yeah.
So I think that idea that actually you can do everything right, as right as you can, and actually things can still
100%. Yeah, 100%. I still work with women who will do the hypnobirthing. They will do, pelvic floor. I've taught them pelvic floor. We've worked on, down training the pelvic floor as well as strengthening it, because it's important to remember that with pelvic floor, it's like any other muscle. People, we often associate pelvic floor with weak pelvic floor, and that is the only reason why you would suffer incontinence, and so on and so forth. But actually, an overactive pelvic floor can still do the same thing. So that can be, pain during sex. It can be incontinence again. So there's two opposites. And I don't think we're often taught about the fact that, like any other muscle, the pelvic floor can be overworked as well. So when you've got someone who, if we tell them to do pelvic floor work, if they're just sort of squeezing, releasing when they're sat down all the day, every day, in a desperate bid to create the, the designer vagina, as they call it, then it could lead to an overactive pelvic floor. So it's important that we understand, and this maybe comes from more like a women's health physio, which I know we've spoken about before. I send a lot of my postpartum clients to go and see a women's health physio first, because there's certain things as a PT that are within my remit and certain things that aren't. And a women's health physio will do an external, and if you want to, an internal pelvic floor examination, where they can pick up on things like prolapse, because, you have to acknowledge that, some exercises, if I hadn't have cleared, signed you off, Gemma, and I was working with you and you were quite, close to postpartum again, and that kind of bladder prolapse hadn't been flagged, then adding on weights or adding anything that's going to build on intra-abdominal pressure could have potentially made that worse. Yeah. So that's what we're dealing with. What could be a very mild case, if undetected, could then be made even worse by jumping into a 90 kilo squat again, or going straight into something that requires a lot of demand on that intra-abdominal section. Because, pelvic floor, we often think it is just that squeeze and release, but actually your pelvic floor muscles are like a sling of muscles that are connected quite deeply to transverse abdominals and deep core, and also your breathing. So as you breathe, it's almost like an integrated exercise you want to do. It's a breathing technique rather than just literally squeeze, release. There is more of a productive way to do it to benefit you more. So it's, first of all, educating women on how to correctly kind of engage pelvic floor and to get the most bang for your buck, but also knowing that overworking it could also lead to the same dysfunction. So it's knowing where you start with a women's health physio. Because, I don't know if many of your followers will know, but, if you guys have got an interest in muscle, you may know that it's all integrated. So, a pain in the knee could have nothing to do with the knee. It could be something to do with the hip. So it's all integrated. And the pelvic floor is directly linked to the jaw. I don't know if I told you this the other day, actually. I did, didn't I? So it's directly linked to your jaw. So when you hold a lot of tension in your jaw, or you see every time you watch One Born Every Minute, you've got people screaming and gritting their teeth, that automatically engages your pelvic floor. So you imagine you're trying to push a baby out, gritting your teeth, tensing your face, it's just going to tense your pelvic floor even more. So there are ways now that hypnobirthing is great, because it's leading people to understand how to calm their body, how to do this. And like you say, natural pain remedies with like cones and stuff like that. So yeah, pelvic floor is really important. But it's just knowing the right thing to do with it, and also understanding, getting that initial assessment done first with a women's health physio, basically.
And would you say, so for instance, we talked a little bit about anybody who, maybe is in that age range of people who are thinking of having children, but are maybe a little bit worried about it because they are aware of this hobby or maybe even job that they have, which is riding horses, and they're worried about, obviously the potential for having to give it up during pregnancy, either for their safety or, some people choose to stop because of obviously risk of baby from falling. That is totally, we're not covering that today, by the way, people. That is entirely, as far as I'm concerned, that's your choice. I rode
personal choice, yeah.
I rode in both my pregnancies to a point. This is not so much about the baby in this particular instance. This is about you, the female who is carrying the baby, and how to keep you safe. Everything else is down to personal choice, and and everyone is different as to how they want to deal with that. But I think, for people who maybe are thinking of, at some point in the next year, 2 years, whatever it might be, they're thinking, I would quite like to have a baby, I'd quite like to get pregnant, but I'm worried about, what's going to happen while I'm pregnant with the horse, and then how soon will I be able to get back riding? Because they've maybe got a bit of a competition. When can I get back to sort of start qualifying for things, or whatever it might be? So what things could they do sort of now, if you like? What things should they be thinking about now that might just, there's no guarantees with anything, obviously, but that might just help them on their journey through that, pre-pregnancy that they can already have as habits, I suppose, ingrained in them before they actually get pregnant?
100%. So, like you've touched on, every birth is so different. Like you said yourself, you can go in knowing everything, having done all the right exercises, having followed all these rules, done all your pelvic floor work, and it still may not come out with the outcome that you wanted. General rule of thumb, they say, 6 weeks recovery from vaginal birth and 12 weeks from a C-section. Again, there could be complications, infections, whatever. So it really depends on personal and individual circumstances. But the attitude that, a woman must wait 6 weeks to do any form of exercise post-birth is quite archaic. C-section, right? It's like the only abdominal operation where you literally cut open through like 4 layers of like skin, fat, muscle, and then sent home within 48 hours with a newborn baby. It's like literally the only operation out there. But when you look at vaginal births, there are exercises you can be doing. So I would say if you were, thinking of starting a family, even if you're in the early stages of pregnancy or in the later stages and you want to start introducing this, my biggest core advice would be understanding correct pelvic floor engagement. So if I stand up, I'll show you this because this is just really key, because this is something that then you can do postpartum. You could do it from day one if you wanted to. So if you're struggling with the idea that you can't get back on the horse, or you've got a little bit of a delay, you're fatigued, all the rest, you lack on sleep, this is something you can start doing from day one if you feel comfortable to do so. So like I say, everybody gets taught pelvic floor as just squeeze, release, squeeze, release. Sorry, we're going to do like this now. It's going to be very hands-on. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. But really, it's that sling, and it kind of comes all the way from the back passage in the anus all the way to the front. It's a massive group of muscles. So by just squeezing, releasing, we're almost really focusing just on the vagina, when actually it's responsible for a hell of a lot more. So you want to imagine you've got this sling from front to back. So you'd use your breath. So as you inhale, you're totally relaxed. So you do inhale. As you exhale, you want to imagine you're bringing pubic bone and sacrum kind of together. So front and back bums come together and then kind of vacuum up. Okay, so it's like an inhale, exhale, release, inhale, exhale. So what you're doing there, instead of it just being just a squeeze that you can do anywhere, you're practically training your body so that it's responsive to the activity you want to get back to. If you're training your core and you're sat down all the time, guess what? When you jump back on a horse, or you go for a walk, or you're running around the kids, it's not going to react because it needs to respond to the activity that you want it to perform for. So if you're then integrating that breathing work, like I say, you could start that just standing up, making a cup of tea or making a coffee, like hours after giving birth, if you want to. Super gentle, doesn't interfere with anything, as long as you feel happy to and you've got sign off, you can quite happily go for that. Then you start to integrate that into your activities. So when you might start to do some squats, body weight. We're not looking at adding any weight on or anything, just body weight squats, body weight push-ups, body weight lunges. You're going to use that same breathing technique so that no matter what your passion is, running, horse riding, weightlifting, your pelvic floor is then automatically responsive, which you don't get from just sitting and squeeze, release as you're watching, EastEnders. Don't know why I picked EastEnders, but it's not going to respond well. So you start to integrate that. Exactly. So that breathing technique for me is like number one key that you could start pre-pregnancy, during, postpartum, no matter what stage. It's the quickest way to start subconsciously as well, getting your brain to reconnect to the core again. So postpartum, especially when it's gone through a real, 9 months of kind of brutal force, it's a good way to start to reconnect brain to core again.
Okay. So what would the implications of, say, having that weak pelvic floor, going back into, and I know you're not sort of a riding expert, but going back into any sort of exercise postpartum, not necessarily just talking about prolapse, which we sort of vaguely touched upon, which obviously is one of the more potentially severe, although there are very, as somebody who has it, there are very different grades of prolapse and different types. So it's not necessarily something to panic about, and it can be, a lot of them can be rehabbed. But in terms of, I suppose, how pelvic floor health and strength affects, I suppose, your balance and your core's ability to fire. And I think the other thing, just based on what you were saying about the breathing, is how is the pelvic floor then connected to the diaphragm? Is there kind of a link with pelvic floor and diaphragm as well? So, you know, which obviously core, diaphragm, pelvic floor, it kind of makes it all more obvious, I think. But yeah, how is that affecting your balance?
Yes.
Everything else? Because obviously, you know, as a rider, we need balance. That's, and not just
right,
but actually for our horses to move well underneath us. If we're not in balance, they're kind of struggling a bit, you know.
Got you. Yeah. So yeah, exactly what you said. You know, if we've got a weak core, so you've got two things basically: your lower lumbar, so kind of right down here on this lower part of the spine. That's obviously put under a lot of pressure during pregnancy, because as your belly grows, we often get this kind of anterior tilt in the pelvis, which gives you that kind of little bit of a curve in the spine. So the muscles are already either super tight in the back and weaker in the core. You know, we tend to generally during pregnancy, back muscles in their kind of quadratus lumborum area get very tight. Glutes can get very weak because of that curve happening. And so what happens there is, obviously, as a horse rider, you're going to rely a lot on core strength and glute strength. Posterior chain needs to be switched on, right? Because, I mean, most of the time, you know, sometimes you're hovering out of the saddle. So that needs to be pretty switched on. I mean, you could correct me here because, as you well know, I'm very allergic to horses.
It depends a little bit on the discipline, but absolutely, yeah, posterior chain is
yes, it's a lot of leg and quad and, you know, glute strength. So when you've got a weak core, not only are you looking at things like prolapse, incontinence potentially, but going back to activity, if you are not rehabbing properly and the core is weak, then yes, it's going to affect your balance. It's going to affect how much you could lift in the gym. It's going to affect running. It's going to affect anything basically that you rely on. And that posterior chain is super important because we have a hormone called relaxin that's released during pregnancy as well. And that hormone can last up to 12 months in a woman's body postpartum. So even when you're not pregnant anymore, if you're breastfeeding, it can last up to 12 months. Now, relaxin's responsibility is to basically relax all the ligaments and joints around the pelvis so that it's easier, I say in inverted commas, to have a baby, to actually deliver. So when you've got that as well fighting against you, not only if you rush back to it, you may have a weak pelvic floor, a weak core, you know, wherever baby sits, touching on your diaphragm comment, but wherever baby sits, we also look at breathing. So after you've delivered, you imagine you've got this baby who's squishing all your organs, you know, squishing everything up. If you feel like you're really short of breath and you're breathing quite high in the chest, that again is going to affect your performance, because if you can't get a full lung of, you know, breath basically, and you're taking very short, sharp breaths, you're not going to be getting that oxygen around the body quick enough. So say if you're a long distance runner, or if you do, you know, CrossFit or something short, sharp, where you need that response action to happen, if you're still really chesty or really low with your breathing, you're not getting a full breath. And obviously, lack of oxygen, your heart rate's going to speed up. You're just not going to be able to perform as well as you did. So yeah, you want to look at the diaphragm as well as an integrated system, because we want a good, nice, deep breath. So sometimes it sounds ridiculous, but we have to just teach the body how to take a deep breath again, because it's just become auto-tuned to take that shallow breath. So yeah, breathing can be affected, core, posterior chain, glutes are getting weaker, and relaxin is also fighting against you by loosening those ligaments and muscles. So you've got to put even more work in, because that, if you are breastfeeding, is going to last even longer versus if you are bottle feeding. And so obviously that is constantly trying to keep the ligaments loose, whereas you're trying to strengthen everything back up again to be stable on your horse. So yeah, it's great being a woman, isn't it?
Brilliant. It's just brilliant. But I think, you know, and again, I think this is what this whole thing is about. It's not saying to people, you know, you're wrong to get back on within a week, because I get it. Like, headspace wise, I stopped riding when I was about 6 months pregnant with Scarlett, and I think 4 months with Dexter, because I was in so much pain. I couldn't ride when I was pregnant with Dexter. I'm hypermobile. I was quite big, and basically a chiropractor said to me when I was pregnant with Scarlett, my first baby, she said, "Are you still riding?" I said, yes. She was like, "What are you getting out of it?" Because she said, "No disrespect, but you have got quite a big bump." And I said, "Well, It just makes me feel a bit like me, really. And she was like, you would be at a very high risk of splitting your pubic symphysis because you are hypermobile. And I just thought, oh, I didn't even, and some people might go, oh, you know, fear mongering, scaring. But actually the rehab, if I had done that, the rehab from that, I'm going to guess, I didn't do it, so thank the Lord. But I did have quite bad pelvic girdle pain postpartum with Scarlett, and throughout pregnancy and postpartum with Dexter was terrible. I think it was about a month before I could get into bed normally. I had to do that, or get into a car. I had to do that, like sitting with legs together and swiveling. I couldn't do anything where my legs moved apart. I just couldn't. It hurt way too much. So, you know, I'm so glad that she gave me that advice, because actually I had zero idea that that was a potential risk. And I don't want to scare anybody. I don't want anyone to watch this going, oh my God, like I need to stop riding now. But I just think that people deserve to be able to make informed decisions about what their body is actually going through, what's genuinely happening within them. And maybe to just, I've been to see a women's health physio, and the work I've done with Dave Sanders, for anyone who's worked with him before, I'm quite body aware. A lot of people say, you know, oh, you're quite aware of your body. It's almost too much sometimes, because my little brain overthinks everything. But for those that aren't so body aware, actually, you know, these things are quite important, because you've had a child, you have no idea how you're going to feel after that. So when you've had this baby and everything feels like it's falling out and you're bleeding heavily and whatever else is happening, you don't know if that's normal, and your normal is not the same as somebody else's normal. So it's so hard to process what is actually going on. Should it be happening? Is it normal? Should it be something you're worried about? So I think that if you know a bit more before it happens and understand how it, and I think like you just put it into perspective there, with the diaphragm linking to the pelvic floor, linking to the core, linking to the, you know, the posture, all of those things. I think the more we can understand how that links, the more you've got a chance of actually, if you've got pain going on somewhere, not just getting that about, yeah, it's just a bit achy, of maybe realizing that actually, if you are still suffering quite badly with lower back pain, you know, maybe that's not to do with your back at all. That could actually just be to do with an incredibly weak core or pelvic floor or somewhere else.
100%.
Like, people don't think about it as an integrated thing enough.
No. I think the statistic is something like 96% of women who had lower back pain also had some form of pelvic floor dysfunction.
Interesting.
So massive link between pelvic floor dysfunction and lower back pain, huge link. And it's not something we would assume. We just wouldn't assume it's got anything to do with it. You know, we are in this kind of world where if you go to the doctor for a cold, they will assess the cold. If you go to the doctor with a painful shoulder, they will go straight to the source of that pain. It's just how it is. You know, there's different physios, osteos, chiros, intrinsic biomechanics. We start to then look at the body as an integrated system. So yeah, 100%. It's you know, there's a massive link with that, with the fact that pelvic floor could lead to that back pain.
And how much do you find, so obviously you touched on the change of posture while pregnant. How much do you find that gets kind of left over post-pregnancy? If not rehabbed, if people aren't aware, is that sort of, you know, is that posture often left behind, if that makes sense, as a, you know, a lovely...
Again, I think it's this attitude that we have as females that, you know, we've grown up with, that probably generations have passed down to us, that you've had a baby, your body's changed, you're probably going to pee yourself now when you get on the trampoline. That's just it. That's just what we're told. You know, if you're very unlucky, and sometimes we go to a male GP and we say, oh, this is happening, and they sort of just, I'm only saying this, I'm not speaking this from my experience, this is what clients have told me, where their GP's just gone, well, darling, you've had a baby. If that's I'm sure it was yourself and someone else that just went, well, you've had a baby, what did you expect? And that's just such a crappy attitude. But there tends to be kind of three areas that you would look at postpartum. So like I said, glutes get very weak because of that kind of front tilt, that anterior tilt to the pelvis. So you've got three areas really that you'd look to rehab. Pelvic floor, number one, breathing, all that sort of stuff. Then you'd move on to what's going on here. So you've got that glute that's stretched, and we need to work on that. You've got core, because that's put on a lot of pressure. So not only is this kind of area weakened, but these QL muscles that sit here are then put under a lot of strain. So what you tend to find is that the QLs will tighten and reduce the amount of mobility and flexibility that you've got. So there's an area already. Then you look at thoracic spine, so kind of from your bra strap here upwards. Now, during pregnancy, you've got boobies. If you're quite well endowed on the boobie front already, then you may associate with this, rounded shoulders, sitting at the desk. Obviously, when you've become pregnant, they are there for a purpose. They're going to fill and get ready to feed your baby, so they get even bigger. And then, no matter how you feed your baby afterwards, whether it's bottle feeding or breastfeeding, you're sat like this, in front of the telly, it's even more strain on that thoracic spine. So there's this thing called upper cross syndrome, which is kind of directly linked to breastfeeding mothers or feeding mothers, where there's a lot of tension through that thoracic spine because we sort of hunch over. So it's about mobilizing and strengthening this upper back. And again, throughout pregnancy, it's the same thing. We look at strengthening the upper back to support the fact that boobs are going to get bigger and posture is going to be affected. We look at strengthening and mobilizing down in that lower lumbar region to try and get that moving better again, because it will be, normally it's very solid. And then we look at strengthening the posterior chain again, hamstring, glutes, all the back of the body that's affected posturally as your bump grows, because you imagine all the weight is on the front of the body, so it's not an even distribution of weight. It's just front loaded, it's all on the front, the back has nothing, and it's just all totally out of whack.
And what I find so interesting about that from an equestrian's point of view is all of those places you've talked about are places we tend, let's be honest, especially any maybe office worker equestrians, are places that people, I would say, tend to be weak anyway. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but again, that office, but also office posture, being on your phone. How many people do you see in that natural round shouldered? And the amount of people, you're trying to get people to, and I'm as bad for it. I have spent a lot of time having to stretch here and really strengthen my traps. And when I do the work on it, the difference in my posture generally, but especially on a horse where I don't then have to think about, that becomes natural. And, just going into more the horse specific stuff, if you are having to think about being here before you're even on a horse, with the 10 million other things you've got to think about while riding, this ain't going to be a priority. This is not going to be an easy thing to fix. So we're already battling against, and weak glutes. How many people do you know that can't activate their glutes regardless? It's a real common, it's getting, I would say probably less so, because I think anyone who's even vaguely into sports stuff now, the building the booty thing has become much more of a popular idea, hasn't it? But I think, I think back to when I first saw a sort of an equestrian specific personal trainer, which is going back, I don't know, 7-8 years, I would think, easy. And when the first thing, and I was quite strong, my core was quite strong, but she was like, did a glute activation check, and I was terrible, utterly terrible. Not that they were weak, but they weren't activating. So we are already potentially fighting against things where we naturally tend to have slightly weaker glutes, posterior chain issues, rounded shoulders, tight pectorals, like say weak upper back, and that mobility in the lower back, hugely important when you're riding a horse, because if you cannot move there, that movement that happens underneath you, there's no way you can move with your horse. And when we're not moving with our horses, we're blocking them. I don't care what anyone says. If you can't move with your horse, you then have these little seat bones that then dig into their back, poke their back down, because you need to be able to move those with them. So add in pregnancy, which then reiterates all those things that actually I think are slightly societal problems anyway, to do with how we live and work generally. I don't even work in an office and I'm still tight here, and I think I blame these people, let's be honest,
Yeah.
And I try not to be too bad, but you end up on phone obviously I have also carrying the child on the one hip as well, which I'm sure people hate us for, but we all do it. We all have a hand that we like to use and the hip that we like to do it. My osteopath the other day was like, do you still carry a child on one hip? I was like, yes. She was like, can you please stop?
Please stop.
She was like, because what happens is your spine curves like this, but your neck then still wants to be straight because your head's still. And I was like, I know, sorry.
Sorry, man. Sorry.
It's all those things, and I think so. Yeah, you say that is how our body reacts to pregnancy. I just find so interesting, because Actually, there probably are quite a lot of females I teach who haven't had children, because actually it's not uncommon, obviously, for women to choose not to, and that's totally fine too.
Yeah.
And actually, within the horse world, I say it's really quite common, because a lot of people have this thing they really love doing, they choose not to go down the children route at all. But it's still an issue that some of them have. But add in pregnancy, and you're really kicking that in, aren't you? You're really adding that extra stress into it.
Massively. And this is why I started initially with a pre-pregnancy program. So before you're even pregnant, because it sounds silly, I think, unless you've had children, that completely, like you said, driving interferes with lower lumbar, driving interferes with pelvic, driving, vibrations affect nerves. So sciatic nerves can be irritated by vibrations. Sitting at a desk all day, bad posture, or just sleeping funny, all these things can already affect those areas. And like you say, if you're then adding the load of a potentially 10-pound baby onto the front of you, as well as the placenta, as well as the water weight you put on, as well as just general a little bit of weight that you might put on, that's only going to make these things worse. It's only going to make that back pain or that kind of discomfort that you get home from work and you think, oh God, like my back's killing me today, what a day. It's only going to make it worse. So that's where that program first came about, was instead of waiting during pregnancy and then having even more to work on postpartum, nip it in the bud before you even get pregnant. Make sure your body is functioning as perfectly as it can be. Before then, you think about starting a family, and give yourself a better chance of then feeling great during pregnancy with little to no back pain, hip pain, knee pain, and then have hopefully a quicker recovery postpartum.
Yeah, I mean, it makes so much sense. So much sense. And I think, coming at it from the equestrian side of things as well, we are notoriously terrible at looking after ourselves. And we're not the only ones, but notoriously very good at looking after our horses. Finding them all the right, if they've had an injury, they would be rehabbed. If we've had an injury, not so much, where does that come in? And I think from that point, and I think the interesting point to make then as well is, if all of that is weak, if that doesn't get addressed and rehabbed correctly, where is the pressure going? Like, what are the potential compensations, I suppose? I know obviously diastasis recti is a complication anyway of pregnancy, but presumably adding in not rehabbing that posture and anything else. I mean, maybe you can touch on it, but give us a proper explanation of what diastasis recti is, and presumably that posture, that inability to then correctly engage the core and use yourself is going to put more pressure there. Have I understood that kind of correctly?
Yeah, so diastasis recti is there is a certain amount of abdominal separation that pretty much every woman will go through, because you've got these two ab walls here, labia alba in the middle. So when you are pregnant and your belly grows, it has to make space for that belly to come through. So for baby to kind of pop through your abs don't stretch with it, they will come out to the sides and separate. Now, for most women, that will naturally come back together again postpartum. It may take a couple of weeks. And you can test on yourselves how you do it to see what that ab separation is. But for some women, it doesn't come back together. And what can happen, interestingly, that actually a lot of exercises that women will probably put into their programming to strengthen their core can often be some of the worst ones if you have had abdominal saturation that isn't coming back together. So if you imagine it's the obliques here, which sit on the side, if you're doing a lot of side planks, Russian twists, rotation, cable pulls, all these different things that require rotation, and you're strengthening that rotation, that can actually prevent or slow down the healing process of diastasis. So you're strengthening the obliques is actually interfering with your rehab. So interestingly, what a lot of women would probably, like I say, add into their program can actually go against what they're trying to achieve, which is just bringing that back together. Obviously, if that ab wall isn't there, then it's not in its kind of full structure, so it's not going to be working to its full potential. And then obviously looking at, what can interfere. If there is a certain dysfunction, which could be as small as like a 2 millimeter leg length discrepancy. So, if there's that small difference, that can have a massive impact. It can be hip pain, it can be shoulder pain, it can be knee pain. And we always look at the trunk of the body first, because if there's dysfunction in the pelvis or the lower spine, then often you can work on those areas and it will correct areas, like it will drop the pecs, so it will drop the shoulders back. It will improve even the gait of your feet. So if you're someone who has a slight pronation and you roll inwards, sometimes working on the hips and working on any kind of imbalance there can level out the feet. So because the pelvis goes through so much during pregnancy, that's why it's so important we rehab it as a whole, with the core, with the breathing, with the pelvic floor, all together, so that hopefully later on down the line, when you go back to whatever activity you enjoy, you're less likely to get injured, you're less likely to feel aches and pains. The list is endless. But yeah, we always work on that pelvis and spine first.
That's really interesting what you say about the rotation exercises though. So and I've never really thought about this actually, and I've thought a lot about this in terms of our separation, but that rotation technique, that idea of using your obliques, mucking out, sweeping, all the things we do on the yard, sweeping, carrying a hay bale, carrying a straw bale, carrying one bucket in one hand rather than two, which we all know we shouldn't do, but we still do. All of those things are either rotation or very much relying on the obliques.
Absolutely.
You go back and think, well, I'm not riding yet. You're mucking out 4 horses, or even just 1 horse twice a day, or sweeping the yard, or any of those things, throwing a rug on.
That's still load. I'm assuming that's pretty heavy stuff as well. Like that is
still
how
you're throwing it.
The equivalent. Yeah, that's still the equivalent of probably picking up 5-10 kilos of something. That's just like weightlifting. It's just exactly the same. It's just a different kind of resistance and different loads.
Also almost worse in a way, because you should, with weightlifting, or most people will if they do it to a reasonable level, even if they come back to it, probably are focusing on their breathing while they're lifting the weights, hopefully on correct technique, and hopefully with the weightlifting there's much more of a structured way of doing it. But actually with a rug, they're not thinking about actually doing it on an exhale, or not holding their breath while they do it and creating, because actually people probably naturally a bit weak, we know, don't they, people hold their breath while they create the pressure. So that's actually that's raising a really interesting point about twisting, postpartum.
100%
in the yard and do a bit of sweeping, and that'll be all right. That's not too much. That's interesting actually. And just as a bit interestingly, I think I told you about this before, again, diastasis recti, it's not the people don't necessarily realize they've got it, because it's not. I had a friend who was like back to normal, like she's tiny, she's really slim anyway, and it's only because we got chatting about the fact, I can't remember what we were talking about. I was struggling to lose my belly after I've had Dexter, and she mentioned to me that after she'd had a full meal, her 2 boys joked that she still looks pregnant. And her youngest would have been 3 or 4 by this point. So quite a long way down, we're a long way down the road. And I said to her, you do know that's not entirely normal. Like you shouldn't look basically pregnant again after a meal. I said, have you ever checked yourself for DR, for diastasis recti? And she was like, for what, sorry? And she's no dummy. Like, you know what I mean? She's not a muppet. And she had no idea what it was, how to check for it, and what the symptoms were. She did check for it, and she's like, I'm pretty sure I've got it, because I told her, how to do the quick check of the finger. And so she said, oh, should I go to my GP? I said, in the nice possible way, no disrespect to GPs, but depending on who you get, I said the chance of you getting any good info was limited. So I sent her off to a women's health physio, and she happened to go to the one that I'd used. He said that she could feel her bowel. The separation was bad enough that she could basically feel her bowel, and she was like, how you haven't ended up with a hernia, because she was riding
100%.
for years. She's been riding, she's been lifting her children, she's been doing all the things that go with owning a horse, i.e. lifting bales of shaving, emptying wheelbarrows, carrying buckets of water, all of those things. And she had this huge, huge, and it's not just the width, is it, from what I can gather, it's also the depth of it. So it can still be, it can be narrower, but still quite deep, and still potentially. And it's
everybody say it can lead to things like abdominal walls popping through, things popping through that little gap like a hernia. So it's not great, because you don't want that separation there, and the longer it's left, you are more at risk of you know, especially if you're putting a lot of intra-abdominal pressure through your body from lifting, from exercise, from picking up children, from going to the gym, all of the daily things as well as additional daily things, then that's putting under a hell of a lot of pressure.
Yes, I think, and I just think that's why it's so important to know, you know, just what these risks are and what the complications of them can be. Because actually, here, you know, for most people, from what I can gather, you know, diastasis is quite healable, isn't it? If you give it the time and do it correctly. But the implication of not doing that rehab, you're going to have a much longer time. And I think this is where we need to get to. If you have a horse that's done a tendon, you know, you don't give them 6 months off and then jump back on and go and gallop them around the cross-country course again. You rehab it because you know there's a good chance of it happening again. But for some reason, with our bodies, we seem to think that actually, like, the might happen thing is something not to worry about. But actually, if we rehab properly, prehab and rehab properly, is that not a much better way of dealing with it, of potentially not issues that might be, you know, might be quite serious and quite difficult to rehab, and actually, just from a really selfish point of view, are going to put you out of action for longer. So, you know,
I think it's probably a combination of that. Like you say, you know, we love our animals. I care for my bloody dog more than I do myself. Sometimes I feed her better than I feed myself, but you know, I think it's a combination of that, but also the fact that if we experience knee pain, regardless of pregnancy or postpartum or whatever, we're generally, most of the time as women, we're pretty good at then going to see either a GP, physio, whatever. Because I don't think there is much of a conversation around prehab and rehab with pregnancy and postpartum, I think we're even less likely to go and get something seen or checked up or assessed, because there isn't much information. You know, I was saying to you the other day, wasn't I, that one of my clients has had, you know, a very active pregnancy. She did everything by the book, but didn't have a very pleasant birth. Ended up having 2 episiotomies done, and was just literally handed a leaflet on day 7, chucked out the hospital with a leaflet on pelvic floor. No booking for a checkup, no booking to see if the stitches have healed, no booking to make sure that actually nothing had prolapsed, nothing. And like you say, this is not to you know, slag off the NHS. There's absolutely nothing more I could say other than it's probably just underfunding, maybe a little bit of an archaic way of looking at pre and postnatal. I don't know, but there's definitely, I think, because we're not educated enough on what can be impacted when we experience these things, we just don't probably seek the advice that we want to get or we should get.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, because I went down, you're right actually, because when I first suspected prolapse, I went down all the potentially right channels and might as well not have bothered. You know, I went to the GP first, sadly saw 2 elderly male GPs. And again, I do not want to get into GP bashing, but ultimately what experience can I possibly have? And one of them literally said to me, I mean, you know, there's maybe mildly something going on down there, but I can't even believe it's causing you any discomfort. And I thought, because obviously you're me and you know, you've been through this before. Luckily, I stuck to my guns. I did my research, and actually, luckily, I had the funds to go and see a women's health physio privately. You know, I not made of money, but I was just like, actually, this is something that's important enough to me that I will go and pay, because I need to know. And it's the best thing I ever did, without a doubt. And I learned so much. And I know when I first sort of was introduced to sort of who you are and what you did, straight away I was like, oh, I need to speak to her. Like, that is somebody I absolutely need to speak to, because I still have it with friends, you know, and they'll say to me, and this is, you know, non-horsey friends, and they're like, oh yeah, oh, what we're doing, we're going for a run this weekend, are we? I better pack my period pants then, just in case I leak. And I'm like, guys, you know that although it's common, it's not normal, and it doesn't have to be like that. But almost because they didn't have anything as serious as I did, in terms of I had them on prolapse, I felt quite uncomfortable. Actually, those that haven't had any major issues, I suppose, or issues they weren't expecting to have, haven't gone down the route of getting anything checked or finding out anything, because, you know, wetting yourself a little bit becomes just something that happens. Like you say, you know, you go on the front. I just said to my women's physio, I do not care. Hi Rachel, thank you. I do not care. You know, that's not something that's acceptable to me. The idea that I can't jump on a trampoline with my children is an unacceptable thought. So
yeah,
I'll do what I can. And I know it's not solvable for everybody to the full effect, but I think it's a lot more solvable for a lot more people than people realise.
Yeah, definitely.
And I just think it's a shame that people don't have more information. So that is why
I agree.
I'm so keen to do this chat, because like I say, it's information. You can make informed decisions then about what you choose to do or not do, and actually not just say don't ride for 6 weeks, but actually what if mentally it is just super important for you to be able to get on a horse, that's fine, but maybe get on that horse knowing what things you can do that are very unlikely to have any negative impact, and what things you can have previously done and can still be doing in the background to give you the best chance of that being a successful progression back into riding. And I think that for a lot of people, what you do would be so important, because having a framework, okay, I can't ride yet, or I shouldn't ride yet, or ideally I won't ride yet, or if I do, I'll just have a sit on a walk on something sensible, because I know that at home I've got this, I've got a progression, this and this to do, that I know is going to get me to there. And I think if you came out of hospital having had a baby with a 6-week rehab program, or 12-week rehab program, or however it might be, depending on whether you've had what sort of birth you've had, and everyone's would be slightly different, obviously. If everyone came out with that, I just think that, those who can't do it, don't want to do it, haven't got time for it yet, are too tired, can't see how it fits in, totally fine. But for people like me who maybe, and there's a lot of people like me around, who I struggled to lose the weight after my second child because I was in so much pain. I knew I couldn't do the workouts I wanted to be able to do, the high intensity, higher impact workouts that I enjoy. I knew I could lift big weights. I knew I had to be careful because I've had a prolapse previously. I knew I had like DR, ab separation. I was lucky enough to know those things and to already have a great women's health physio to work with. So she knew me well enough to know that she needed to give me something to do. So she set me then, and I wasn't perfect. I didn't do it every day. I was sometimes far too tired, far too exhausted, and couldn't do it. But on the days I wanted to do something, I was like, don't go and jump around like an idiot and do something stupid, Gemma. Do what your physio's given you, and do that. And I think if more people had access or understood what people like you can do for them, it's not just physical. I think it's mental. That mental, having a crutch of a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, that you are going to feel like yourself again, because some of us, we really don't for a long time.
No, like you say, it's sometimes more of a mental thing, and it's frustration that you can't get back to what you enjoy. So if you can fill that time period, like you say, before going back onto the horse riding, with a program that's going to benefit you more, but keep you active and keep you mentally stimulated while you're kind of in this 6-week run of eat, sleep, feed, change, repeat, then it's just something that breaks out for you as well when you're desperate to get back.
Yeah, no, totally. No, I think that's brilliant. And I think probably I've kept you for long. I mean, I could keep asking you questions all night. And I'm sure there's loads of stuff we still haven't covered about pregnancy, but hopefully that's given some people a little bit of insight about pelvic floor, about postural changes, about the changes. I know we didn't cover it hugely, but the pelvis's involvement in pregnancy, and obviously the pelvis is hugely important in riding and stability. And just the compensatory issues and things that can happen that maybe can't always be prevented, but might be able to be prevented, might be able to be kept on top of, or at least you might recognize when it's happening. You might know what to look for. So if you go a bit too far, it's fine, we all do, but you might know what to look for at that point. And I think that's probably just as important, isn't it, to know?
Yes. Yeah, if you can start to understand signals and understand when something, for example, if someone experiences lower back pain chronically, we might give them a certain amount of exercises. We'll work together for a good 12 weeks, trying to ease that out and strengthen it at the same time. But then they have the tools then to, when they start to feel that flare up come up again, they know exactly what exercises to go back to make sure that doesn't become, a level 10 flare up. It just becomes a level 3 for a day, and then the next day they feel fine. So yeah, definitely, it's always those exercises, preparing and preparation, and making sure you know exactly what to tap into. Should it flare up? Should it arise again?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, as I know that we were going to try and cover a little bit about diet and recovery and protein, but I'm hoping we get to this again, and I'm hoping we manage to do this on a live.
Yes.
Here. We're try and nail
it. I could talk a lot about nutrition, so that could be completely separate.
Yeah, sure. I think nutrition, I think possibly, and what I'd love to talk to you about as well, because, no disrespect to, again, my demographic on here, but there are those that maybe haven't had children or aren't going to have children. I'm afraid, sorry ladies, but we are all going to go through the perimenopause and the menopause, and I'm afraid that the hormones affecting us then still aren't great for us. So I think, and again, especially when we're riding, half-ton animals, the potential of falling off, the potential of injury just dealing with them, I do think that another really important conversation to have, so that again, women have the information at their fingertips to use or not. That's entirely up to them. It's whatever. But I know for me, like at the moment, strength training and getting things in order before I turn 40 is an important thing to me, because I know what the implications of later will be if I don't. So like you were saying before, preparing for your future. And I think, so yeah, that's another conversation I'd really love to have with you.
Yeah, definitely.
And we can cover a bit of nutrition and stuff with that, because I think that's probably in that scenario.
100%. Yeah, definitely.
So what I will say to anyone who does come and watch this, if you have any questions, stick them in the comments below, message me. I will put links to Brogan's Facebook page, which is Women Within Fitness Coaching. Is that right?
Yes, fitness community. Yes, Marla.
Yeah, so I'll put the link to Brogan's page. And if there are any, and there's loads of stuff on this already on Brogan's page. She's done various like themed weeks about postpartum, pre-pregnancy, during pregnancy, menopause, etc. If I find any, or if anything comes up that I see that does particularly link in with this, I'll stick the links to those videos, to those lives, in the comments underneath the link I'll put to this recording, because obviously Facebook Live is a pain in the backside and we hate Facebook. Yeah. So yeah, I'll try and make sure I link any info. And I will put a link to Brogan's Facebook page if you're interested, and I would absolutely recommend you check it out and you get on there. It might not all be relevant to you, but it's worth keeping an eye on what lives Brogan's doing, because there's extra little nuggets of information. And also for any, I know she's had some special offers on the things recently, so keep an eye out, because you never know. If you are interested in a full biomechanics workup or anything along those lines, keep an eye on Brogan's page, because there have been some, I would say, fairly good deals recently, so I'd keep an eye on those. Because you might want to just nab one now you've realised how integrated the module is, and how important that biomechanics workup may well be for you. So Brogan, thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I hopefully will speak again soon, and we'll cover a bit
about I'd love to.
menopause and some other women's fitness stuff. Awesome. So great to see you, and thank you to anyone who's watched, and hopefully you found this interesting. As I say, any questions, any comments, stick them in the comments below, drop me a message, drop Brogan a message. We'd love to hear from you. And if there's anything you want in another conversation, then get in touch, because we'll put on whatever you guys want. We like talking about this sort of stuff, so you ask, we'll talk.
Definitely. 100%. Ask you shall receive.
That's great. So thank you very much, Brogan. I will stop the recording there, and thank you all for watching.